This video contains my advice to leaders in the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica, in the aftermath of Prince William and Kate Middleton's recent trip and concerning reparations for slavery. Hello friends, this is Unmasked Truth with Harmanjeet Saini, where I provide unique analysis of world events based on the unmasked truth that after surrender, Germany continued World War II clandestinely and became a killing machine. I also provide true news that you will find nowhere else. Prince William and his wife Kate Middleton concluded their 8-day visit to the Caribbean countries of Belize, Jamaica, and Bahamas for Platinum Jubilee celebrations on the occasions of the 70th year of his grandmother Queen Elizabeth II's accession to Great Britain's throne. All three countries are part of the British Commonwealth of Nations as they were former British colonies, of which the Queen is the titular head of state. In November 2021, Barbados, another former British colony, chose to become a republic, electing its own president as head of state, severing its connection with the British monarchy. Reuters reported that during the leg of the visit to Jamaica, the Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness said during a photo shoot with William and Kate, "There are issues here which as you know, are unresolved. But your presence gives us an opportunity for those issues to be placed in context, to be out front and center, and to be addressed as best we can. But Jamaica is, as you would see, a country that is very proud, and we are moving on, and we intend to fulfill our true ambition of being an independent, fully developed, and prosperous country." The unresolved issues alluded to by Holness include the questions of reparations for slavery and the treatment of Jamaica's Windrush Generation. The Windrush Generation refers to about 500 Caribbean nationals from Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados who arrived in Great Britain in June 1948 as immigrants under the Immigration Act of 1948. They were unskilled workers who came with their children to work and start a new life in Great Britain. No passports were necessary. Today, many people of the Windrush generation have not received British citizenship despite having lived, been educated in Great Britain for decades. They are now losing their jobs, homes, and health benefits, in addition to facing deportation to their countries of origin. Clearly, the Jamaican Prime Minister was hinting that Jamaica plans to sever ties with the British monarchy and become a republic like Barbados. The visit did not go smoothly for the royals as they faced protests in Belize and Jamaica. In Belize, the royal couple had to cancel their first engagement after indigenous Maya people protested their visit to a cacao farm. They visited another cacao farm instead. Then in Jamaica, before their arrival on Tuesday, March 22, 2022, a group of Jamaican leaders published an open letter to William and Kate demanding apologies and restitution for colonial crimes and enslavement. They wrote in the letter, "We see no reason to celebrate 70 years of the ascension of your grandmother to the British throne because her leadership and that of her predecessors have perpetuated the greatest human rights tragedy in the history of mankind." At the protest on Tuesday, human rights activist Kay Osborne told Reuters, "It is an insult to use for these young people, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, to be here to try to persuade us to keep the status quo in place when our goal is to loosen and remove the hands, the gloved hands of the Queen from around our necks so that we can breathe. I wonder how the Queen's hands are around the necks of Jamaicans and suffocating them by being the constitutional head of Jamaica with no role in government. Membership in the British Commonwealth of Nations does not benefit Britain in any way except through mutually beneficial trade. If Jamaica does or does not want to trade with Britain, it is totally free to do whatever it likes. Britain only helps its former colonies through aid, expert advice, and other forms of assistance whenever there might be law enforcement issues or war, for which it incurs some cost for the benefit of the colonies. There is nothing holding the former colonies back from severing ties to the British monarchy anytime they want. Therefore, Kay Osborne's criticism is meaningless spewing of hatred. I am glad that Prince William stated in the Bahamas that in Belize, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, the future is for the people to decide upon. He also said, "We support with pride and respect your decisions about your future. Relationships evolve, friendship endures." He also hinted that the Commonwealth is a club by mutual choice, and in the future the British monarch may no longer be its head, implying that the club could choose the head by vote. Karen Attire in the Washington Post added on March 24, 2022. Protesters in Kingston carried or wore signs telling the British to say us sorry, a local phrase urging the British to apologize. And in honor of 60 years of Jamaican independence, groups posted 60 reasons the British should formally apologize for slavery and more than 400 years of exploitation. In a speech at a dinner hosted by the Governor General in Kingston, Jamaica, Prince William said, "I strongly agree with my father, the Prince of Wales, meaning Prince Charles, who said in Barbados last year that the appalling atrocity of slavery forever stains our history. I want to express my profound sorrow. Slavery was abhorrent and it should never have happened. While the pain runs deep, Jamaica continues to forge its future with determination, courage, and fortitude. The strength and shared sense of purpose of the Jamaican people, represented in your flag and motto, celebrate an invincible spirit." Karen Attaya commented on the speech in her Washington Post article. Prince William continued the British tradition of skirting a direct acknowledgement of Britain's role in the trafficking and enslavement of Africans. During a state dinner Wednesday in Kingston, William expressed profound sorrow, in quote unquote, and said that slavery was abhorrent and it should never have happened. The only thing profoundly sorry about William's remarks is the insulting implication that 400 years of slavery, displacement, and death was a mistake that just happened. The fact that Prime Minister Andrew Holness had campaigned and won election by vowing to turn Jamaica from a constitutional monarchy to a republic indicates that Jamaicans feel strongly about slavery and cutting off ties with Britain. Karen Attaya echoed the sentiments in the Washington Post. Today, a new wave of anti colonial anger has emerged after the global protests sparked by George Floyd's murder and assistance to Britain's wrongful deportations of Caribbean people with ties to the Windrush Generation, those colonial citizens who were lured to Britain to fill a post war labour shortage. Last November, meaning in 2021, Barbados became a republic after the nation formally removed Queen Elizabeth as head of state and installed Sandra Mason, its first president. And Wednesday, in a surprise announcement, Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness told William and Kate that his country will sever ties with the monarchy and intends to become a republic. It's about time. Surely other countries will be next. It's a warning to the future British King and Queen. No amount of royal glitz and glamour can stop a determined people from deciding to chart their own history. Karen Smith, in her comments, is also spewing hatred for the British with no justification. Jamaica is already charting its own history. Having the Queen as the constitutional head and being part of the British Commonwealth do not impact Jamaica's pursuing its own destiny and charting its own history in any way. Both institutions only benefit Jamaica and do not hurt in any way. Raking up George Floyd's death as cause for new wave of anger at colonialism is turning a blind eye to reality. The reality is that George Floyd was put to death because he had committed murder of a white adult to be rewarded by German masqueraders. He was put to death also to stop him from continuing to abuse his white girlfriend. Many other blacks have since been put to death for their past crimes, and because, like George Floyd, they were still continuing to commit crimes. I have very little respect for rabble-rousing journalists who arouse people to violent hatred based on half-truths, fabricated facts, or twisted arguments. Now I would like to address the issue of reparations for slavery. First, here are some definitions of slavery. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines slavery as the practice of slave holding, or the state of a person who is held in forced servitude. or a situation or practice in which people are entrapped as by debt and exploited. Dictionary.com defines slavery as the condition of being legally owned by someone else and forced to work for or obey them, and defines modern slavery as the condition of being forced by threats of violence to work for little or no pay and of having no power to control what work you do or where you do it. Now, slaves are typically made to perform some form of work at a location dictated by the enslaver. Historically, people were enslaved because they were unable to pay their debts or broke the law or were defeated in war and held as prisoners of war. In Jamaica protests, the term chattel slavery was being used. In this form of slavery, the slave legally becomes the property or chattel of the slave owner. Another term used in economics for slavery is de facto slavery, which simply means forced labor for the slave. Many forms of forced labor are practiced in the modern world. Examples include being forced to work in factories and sweatshops in the private sector. Human trafficking is the trade of humans for the purpose of forced labor, sexual slavery in the form of forced marriage or prostitution. Other forms of forced labor include situations such as captive domestic servants or child soldiers. It is estimated that approximately 40 million people were enslaved all over the world in 2019, though it is illegal. Slavery predates written records and has existed in virtually all ancient civilizations and cultures in the world. It usually resulted from non payment of debts, punishment for crimes, and from becoming prisoners of war, and the offspring of slaves being born into slavery. Race based slavery grew immensely beginning in the 14th century. People in the Caribbean, the United States, and former British colonies are the only ones asking for reparations, whereas the institution of slavery has been practiced almost throughout man's history and in virtually all cultures and ancient civilizations. Slavery existed in Pharaoh's Egypt, in Africa, Arab lands, ancient Greece and Rome, the Americas, China, India, Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Spain, Portugal, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain, the United States, Brazil, Mexico, and other countries in Latin America. Yet slavery has been outlawed in almost the entire world because the British people, under the influence of the Bible, felt that the institution of slavery was abhorrent and immoral. The Slave Trade Act was passed by the British Parliament on March 25, 1807, making the slave trade illegal throughout the British Empire. William Wilberforce campaigned relentlessly for abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire and was instrumental in having the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 passed. After having slavery made illegal in the British Empire, the British campaigners then campaigned to encourage other countries such as France to make slavery illegal. Besides making slavery illegal, the British, because of their control of the high seas with their powerful navy, also took action to stop the slave trade. Between 1808 and 1860, the British Navy seized approximately 1,600 ships and freed more than 150,000 slaves. Let us not forget the hand of rulers of African nations in the slave trade. African societies and powerful African individuals often developed and controlled efficient networks to capture their fellow citizens and supply them to European slave traders and determine the goods that the slaves were to be exchanged for. Former presidents of Benin, Ghana, and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya apologized for their country's roles in the slave trade. Thus, the slave trade is a shared, shameful responsibility of Africans, Europeans, North and Latin Americans. However, virtually every nation on earth has been guilty of slavery in its past. Americans fought a civil war to end slavery, which is the bloodiest war in American history, with 625,000 dead, as compared to an estimated 160,500 dead in World War I, 405,400 dead in World War II, 36,500 in the Korean War, and 58,200 in the Vietnam War. Thus, the US lost more men in the Civil War to end slavery than in the next four costliest wars in terms of total deaths in its history. The greatest contribution of the British and American people in ending slavery has been to end it in their own countries or empire and then using force or persuasion to end the trade and slavery worldwide. Even today, wherever they see conditions similar to slavery existing, they try to persuade the perpetrators to change, such as in the Sudan, and they've tried it in Afghanistan. How come no people on earth have been clamoring for reparations except Africans, particularly Africans from former British colonies and America and the former British colony of India? Pakistan and Sri Lanka are not calling for reparations from the British. And this clamor for reparations started around the mid 1990s when the question of restoring looted Jewish assets by the Germans during World War II was raised, with Britain and America joining in the call. This bit of information should give us a clue about how the call for apology for slavery and reparations started around the 1990s. I've been exposing German nefarious activities since World War II and how they continued the war clandestinely, with German masqueraders around the world joining in with gusto. After the war, the largest German corporations fanned across the globe in a bid to boost Germany's economy with export led growth. Embedded in the German corporations were Nazis under the guise of technical advisors. They made alliances in all countries to hurt British and American interests and murder as many of them as possible clandestinely, along with others who fought them during the war. They found very willing allies among Indians who began murdering white Americans, Britons, and Sikhs of India because they participated in the war in large numbers as part of the British Indian Army. Therefore, when the Germans incited Indians to start clamoring for reparations, Indians obliged. That's why you hear of a call for reparations from India and nothing from Pakistan and Sri Lanka. German masqueraders in America have had an alliance with African Americans since the late 1950s. African Americans did not ask for reparations till the late 1990s or early 2000s because they were making great gains through civil rights and affirmative action in America. And those who murdered white people of non German descent clandestinely were being rewarded by them. Clamor for reparations started when the German masqueraders told them to do so in the late 1950s after a call for returning looted Jewish assets was made. The question has been raised about what amount to ask for in reparations. There is actually no difference between $5 billion in reparations or $100 trillion in reparations. It takes no extra effort at shaking the tongue when asking for 5 billion or 100 million in reparations. That's how the amount for reparations is being bandied about. For me, the figure for reparations is just some noise that enters my ear occasionally and then goes out immediately. I have an interesting story to tell in that regard. On May 28, 2015, a debate was held at Britain's Oxford University Union on the motion, "This House believes that Britain owes reparations to her former colonies." One of the speakers in the debate for the motion was Shashi Tharoor, India's Member of Parliament and a former Under Secretary General of the United Nations. His speech went viral and garnered more than 4 million views. To cash in on the popularity of his speech, Tharoor subsequently wrote a book titled An Era of Darkness, The British Empire in India. After listening carefully to videos of false speakers in the debate on both sides and reading the outright lies and fabrications in Tharoor's book, I wrote my own book titled Britain Does Not Owe Reparations to Its Former Colonies in July 2017. In his book, Tharoor cited figures to show that the British extracted nearly $5 billion from India's economy from 1800 to 1901. I showed that the benefit to India's economy due to British irrigation schemes alone was above $100 billion. Then the United States and Britain pump about $100 billion annually into India's economy through information technology exports and about $20 billion annually in remittances by Indians to relatives in India. Because of the multiplier effect, this boosts India's economy to the tune of 300 to $500 billion annually. These calculations were made in 2017. During the past 5 years, these figures have only grown much larger. In the past decade, India has exported about $1.3 trillion in information technology services with a likely impact of perhaps $5 trillion boost to India's economy. Hence, India has already received far more than $5 trillion in compensation from the United States and Britain. The interesting part of the story is that after I published my book in 2017, we started seeing the figures for reparations that Britain owes to India begin to escalate out of all proportions. Instead of billions of dollars in reparation, we started hearing figures in the trillions. Again, it takes no extra effort on the part of the tongue to come out with a figure of billions of dollars versus a figure of 2 trillion or $100 trillion. In my book, I believe I convincingly argued with data that Britain owes no reparations to India or any of its former colonies. God says of the Germans in Nahum's prophecy in Nahum chapter 3, verses 1 and 19. Chapter 1 states, "Woe to the bloody city," using Assyria's ancient capital Nineveh as a representation of Assyria, whose modern descendants are Germans. "It is all full of lies and robbery. The prey departs not." So here are four characteristics of the Germans very precisely identified. They are given to much bloodshed in the world. They are liars through and through. They are wholly given to robbing other people. And they are always preying on and victimizing some people or the other at all times. Then verse 19, "Upon whom has not your wickedness passed continually?" This prophecy tells us that in the end time no people on earth will escape the Germans' evil. That is what you see at work in the world today. Germany fulfilling this prophecy by inciting evil in virtually every nation on earth, with the evil directed at America, British Commonwealth nations, the Jewish state of Israel, and other Israelite nations in northwestern Europe such as France, Scandinavian, and Benelux countries. That is the evil source of all these calls for reparations, which started only after Germany was asked to restore Jewish assets that they had looted during World War II. Now let's see Germany's history of slavery by these newfound champions for former slave nations. Germany too has a colonial past. Though it was short lived, it was much more brutal than anything that was experienced anywhere under the British Empire. Germany colonized in two waves. In 1884 and 1885, after the Berlin Conference, when European states divided Africa, Germany acquired German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, Cameroon, Togo, German East Africa, today's Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, and parts of Papua New Guinea. Then, in the second wave in 1898 and 1899, Germany acquired colonies in the Pacific Islands. Then Germany lost them all due to the Versailles Treaty after World War I. In the German colonies, Africans were subjected to forced labor, especially on the rubber and cotton plantations. Many of their cultural and religious practices were forbidden, and African women were often abused. Such practices led to revolts. Rebellion in German Southwest Africa and in German East Africa led to colonial wars. In the Herrera Rebellion in German Southwest Africa, between 40,000 and 100,000 Africans were murdered, many dying of starvation and dehydration in the desert. The Maji Rebellion in German East Africa resulted in the murder of 80,000 to 300,000 people. In the Herrera Rebellion, German General Lothar von Trotha issued a proclamation on October 2, 1904, that many believed to be an official call for genocide. The proclamation said, "Inside German territory, every Herero tribesman, armed or unarmed, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will no longer give shelter to women and children. I will drive them back to their people or have them shot. The colonial war continued until 1907, but the fighting did not stop at that time. From 1905 on, the Germans established concentration camps in Namibia for all surviving Herero and Nama, many of who died there due to the harsh conditions. Often estimated Herero population before the war of 40,000 to 100,000, only 15,130 survived by 1911. Often estimated 20,000 Nama, there were only 9,781 survivors. Shashi Tharoor crows a lot in his book about German apologies to the Jews, but he says nothing about German atrocities in Africa, about which the German public has complete amnesia. No such brutality took place during British rule in India except during the 1857 mutiny, in which massacre of British women, children, and civilians was started by Indians, with the British then committing similar atrocities in retaliation. Before this incident, or even afterwards, the British did not attack women, children, and civilians in their former colonies unless they were opposing British rule. Now consider the American Civil War, the bloodiest in America's history. Now we know who were on each side of the war. The Confederates were German masqueraders who were fighting to keep the institution of slavery intact in America, whereas people of British or Israelite descent were fighting to abolish it. That is the history of slavery by the newfound champions of former slaves, the German masqueraders clamoring for reparations for them. God determined the outcome of the war and the abolitionists won, so that the institution of slavery would not continue to stain their history. And after that, they worked to end slavery everywhere else on earth to the extent that they had power to do so. Britain and America have learned from the colonial experience. They don't seek to repeat that experience and are a force in the world today in preventing other nations from doing so. They are in the forefront of bringing democracy to nations around the world such as Nepal, Iraq, Sudan, and Afghanistan by persuasion through the United Nations. There is a very good reason why God had a hand in ending German colonialism. Former German colonies Rwanda and Burundi provide excellent examples. Germans are Satan worshippers and would have imposed their ways of murder and bloodshed and imparted their ways of thinking on the colonies. They did that in Rwanda and Burundi, their colonies. Then the German masquerade of Francois Mitterrand, President of France, interfered in the affairs of these nations. The result were massacres in the tiny nations which surpassed genocide per capita than any place on earth. Burundi lost 150,000 to 300,000 of their population in 1972 and around 25,000 in 1988 and 1993 respectively. Rwanda lost about 800,000 of its population in massacres in 100 days in 1994. In contrast, God allowed colonialism by the British, French, and the Americans because he knew that they would make the truth of the Bible accessible to the colonies and teach it. God planned it that way because he had prophesied in Genesis 49, verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. This shows that the descendants of Joseph, the British and American people, would be a colonizing people. However, the history of slavery by the Germans and German masqueraders did not end with the Civil War, with the American Civil War, or Germany being stripped of its colonies. Jim Crow South and oppression of African Americans was the handiwork mainly of German masqueraders. Whenever the Germans or German masqueraders have gained the upper hand, they have enslaved other people any way they can and begin preying on them as the prophet Nahum prophesied. Consider German slavery during World War II. During the Second World War, Nazi Germany effectively enslaved about 12 million people, 15 million when one considers turnover and deaths, who were considered undesirable as well as people brought over as manual labor from conquered countries as well as prisoners of war. The Nazi plans were to keep these subhumans. That is what they call them. That's what they call all other people, subhumans, as permanent slaves without any rights who could be worked to death if required. Besides Jews, the worst treatment was meted out to people from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Living and working conditions were so harsh that brutality, tortures, hunger, and severe malnutrition were the main causes of death. In addition, many died due to their places of work being bombed by the Allies. In May 2001, German industry and government agreed to pay compensation to about 1 million people who worked as slave laborers in Germany during the war. A fund of $4.5 billion was set up. The compensation would be one-time payments of up to $6,700 for those who were forced to live in ghettos. Those who worked in factories received $2,200. The same Germans are now urging Indians and citizens in Caribbean nations such as Jamaica and others to ask for compensation of trillions of dollars. The descendants of the other 14 million who had already died by then received no compensation due to the Second World War. Not many Americans, Britons, and people of other nations have escaped from German evil after World War II. During their research into nuclear weapons and ICBM technology in China, they stumbled onto the technology. Actually, probably Satan inspired them to deliver threats electronically directed into the ears of people in the early 1960s. They have exploited that technology to the hilt over the past 60 years, or at least for 40 years till the existence of German masqueraders was fully discovered around 2000 and 2001. With the help of that weapon, they have looted America's wealth, made many white Americans of non-German descent into economic slaves, with threat forcing them to hand over control of the largest corporations, depriving many of jobs and promotions, and have murdered 9 to 10 million of them by cremating 5 to 6 million alive in electric crematoriums and medically murdering 3 to 4 million more, and forcing an additional 30 to 40 million white babies to be aborted. Some were forced to become homeless or become drug addicts by threats. They continue to prevent people from marrying and force many to marry darker people, such as some Italian Americans, or marry interracially and commit untold atrocities against whites. An example being George Floyd and other African American males who had to be put to death over the past 2 or 3 years for continuing to commit atrocities. That is the history of slavery by these new champions of former slaves around the world. Their methods to enslave other people still continue to be used in one form or another. I know much of this from first-hand experience because I have been their victim for the last 61 years. The story of slavery by the Germans, however, has not ended with the existence of German masqueraders being fully discovered around 2000 and 2001. They are prophesied to win a world war and will then unleash the worst tribulation in the history of mankind. They will enslave the American, British, and Jewish people. The mistreatment of slaves will be so brutal that 90% of the slave population will perish. God will have to intervene to rescue the survivors. This is prophesied in Joel 3 verses 1 to 3. For behold, in those days, this phrase refers to the end time, meaning our time. And at that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah, meaning the Jews, and Jerusalem, referring to America and British Commonwealth nations, because Jerusalem was the capital of undivided ancient Israel under Kings David and Solomon. And continuing in verse 2, I will also gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat in Jerusalem, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, meaning America, British Commonwealth nations, and the Jews, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my lands. They scattered them among the nations after defeating them in war and enslaving them and selling them as slaves throughout the world. And they have cast lots for my people, and have given a boy for a harlot, means sold as slaves, sold boys as slaves for small price, as the number captured of slaves will be in the high tens of millions, or even up to 100 million, and then sold a girl for wine that they may drink. I hope you are slightly better informed about the Germans and German masqueraders, the new-found champions of former enslaved or colonized people who are inciting their descendants in America and former British colonies to clamor for reparations in the trillions of dollars. I will discuss the reparations issue in part 2 and will offer my advice for those who join the Germans and German masqueraders from America and former British colonies in their evil schemes. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please continue to watch my videos and read my articles on important world events, World War III watch, politics, international business, advice on health and medical problems, and much more for in-depth and insightful analysis. Please also subscribe to my YouTube and Facebook channels, Unmasked Truth with Harmanjeet Saini, to view and get information on the latest videos. Some people do not have the time to go through the full length of videos. They find it more convenient to read the text of the video. Unfortunately, YouTube does not provide the facility to make the text of my videos available on YouTube. But fortunately, Facebook does provide that facility. So I make the text of my videos available on my Facebook channel, which you can then easily copy.